Hey everybody, we'll get started in just a minute. We'll give people a chance to join. Um, Thanks for being here, and thanks for being patient. We'll get started in just a minute or two. Perhaps while we wait for others to join, just a couple of things, some housekeeping stuff. I don't, this is the first time I'm using this GoToWebinar. Maybe it's familiar to some of you, but there are some ways that you can interact with the webinar. One is with the questions button. There should be an icon especially if you expand your window all the way in the upper right, there should be an icon that has a conversation bubble with a question mark in it. You can use that to ask questions. Also, if you need attention or you would like to interrupt to ask a question, you can also use the raise hand button, which should be down in the lower left part of the screen. So it is what, 1:02? Maybe I'll wait one more minute and then we'll go ahead and get started. Okay, well, I'm gonna start now. Welcome everybody. This is the Know Your Cost of Production, a webinar for hazelnut growers. My name is Rich Schwartz, and I'm joined here today by Ben Larson and Peggy Bengry. I'm with my organization's called Alder Street Consulting, based here in Portland. And my business provides business support services to agricultural producers, businesses, organizations, and governmental agencies at the intersection of food production, sustainability, and social justice. Um, I'd like to introduce the panelists now as well. Ben, do you want to say hi?
Yeah, hi. My name's Ben Larson with my brother's farm. Grow about 70 acres of certified organic hazelnuts in the South Valley.
Great. Peggy?
And I'm Peggy Bengry with Red Wing Farm in the North Valley, a much smaller operation, only 3 acres of Jefferson hazelnuts, organic.
Great. Thanks, Peggy.
Yes.
Okay, just to go over the agenda for today, I'll start by talking about the project background that led to the webinar today. And then I'll provide details on a tool that was developed specifically for organic hazelnut growers to get a better understanding of their cost of production. And it turns out that the tool can be used by conventional growers as well. It can be in fact, used by pretty much anyone producing perennial crops, but specifically it was focused on organic hazelnut production. So I'll start with an overview of the tool, and then I'll talk a little bit about what prerequisites, things that you should do ahead of time before using the tool. And then I'll talk about actually using the tool, actually entering the data. And then I'll talk some about how to use the tool to perform different kinds of analyses. So that'll be my part, and then we'll have a conversation with the growers. The two panelists who are with us today participated as in the program as they were in a pilot program, so they got the chance to use the tool and help shape it and into the form that it's in today. And then finally, at the end, we'll have a Q&A. Although, if you do have questions as we're going along, feel free to ask a question in the question box or raise your hand, and I'll do my best to try to address questions as we go along as well. So just a little bit of background on the project. Initially, it was a collaboration between Oregon Tilth and the Oregon Organic Hazelnut Collective. And so they wrote a grant to Western SARE, the, what is it? The Sustainable Agriculture Research and Education Program, a USDA program. And just a note that the funders for this project have requested that we gather data about the effectiveness of the program. And one way we're doing that is by trying to get feedback from the webinar participants. So after the webinar is over, we'll be sending you an email with a link to a brief survey. And everybody who completes the survey will then get a follow-on email with information on how to download the costing tool. So the goal of the project was to improve the viability of organic hazelnut enterprises by helping producers better understand their production costs. So there really aren't any published enterprise budgets for organic hazelnut production. And so while this project was not an attempt to create that kind of an enterprise budget, we did want to be able to give growers tools to be able to better understand their costs. So yeah, so ideally it would have been nice to be able to come up with some benchmarks for organic hazelnut production. I mean, I guess the gold standard is to be able to publish a value that's, you know, the average cost per pound to grow organic hazelnuts, but we're a pretty long way away from that yet. We're going to need more growers and more years of data before we're going to be able to publish anything like that. But the tool is still an effective way to, you know, help you understand your costs. So it was a 3-year project and started in 2021. Tanya Murray, who was a farm viability specialist at Oregon Tilth, she was the principal investigator and the person who wrote the grant and shepherded the project through for the first 3 years, or 2.5 years, I guess. And in 2021, she brought together a cohort of 6 organic hazelnut growers. And so in 2022, those cohort members ran some time trials on their operations, and they recorded data about their production practices. And then Tanya used some of that data, and in conversation with the growers, she built a tool for recording and analyzing the data. So then in early 2023, Tanya worked with the growers to help do this analysis, doing cost calculations, analyzing results, and then she used that feedback to refine the tool and recommend processes for data collection and analysis. In the fall of last year, Tanya left Oregon Tilth, and that's when I stepped into the project. So I started by working with the growers who stuck with the program. So there were 4 of the 6 original growers who brought it through to completion. And then, so I helped them with some of their analyses. And then here in 2024, I finished polishing up the tool and have now made it available for download. And in addition to the tool itself, there's also a fairly extensive user's guide, and there's a version of the tool that has sample data available. So what's the costing tool? It is a tool that allows growers to account for the variable costs that are directly related to hazelnut production. And so the 3 costs in particular that we're going to be measuring are costs related to labor, machinery, and inputs. So labor, of course, is all the work that anybody's doing to establish and care for the orchard and harvest the nuts. Machinery costs are the operational costs for running the machines that support those labor activities. And then the input costs are, any inputs that you put onto the orchard, whether that's for, managing crop nutrition or soil fertility or preventing, weeds or pests or diseases. So the tool, again, focuses on these variable costs, and then you can use that as a jumping off point to do further analyses. So you can include other costs as part of that analysis. So some of your fixed costs, like marketing costs, or your just general business or overhead costs. And then you can also use the tool to do to consider, depreciation costs or the cost of replacing your machinery or infrastructure. You can do an analysis for making sure that your orchard is going to be able to cover the establishment costs that you have, and also for running a variety of what-if scenarios. Okay, and so ultimately the tool is a Google workbook or a type of spreadsheet, and it's available online, and you would just download a copy of the tool from the web, and then you can use it either as a Google workbook or as an Excel spreadsheet, whichever program you feel more comfortable working in. In addition to the tool itself, it's also accompanied by this user guide that I referenced earlier. And the user's guide has step-by-step instructions for using the tool. It also has some suggestions for ways that you can use the tool to do some analysis on your orchard and use that financial data. And then there's a few case studies in the user's guide, as well as an overview for performing time studies, which I'll get into in just a little bit. And the tool has this version that has sample data included. And the sample data is there really as an inspiration and to provide guidance for you as you're filling out the tool with your own data. The sample information was gleaned from the farms that participated in the pilot program, but it's not really intended to be an accurate reflection of any particular farm. And it's also definitely not supposed to be a prediction of what the costs on your farm are going to be. It's really just there to provide some guidance as you go through the process of filling out the tool yourself. Okay, so next I'm going to talk about things that you'll need to do before you can start using the tool. And so you'll start by gathering some data that will allow you to analyze your labor costs. So step one will be to make a list of all the activities that go into producing hazelnuts on your farm, and so you'll just brainstorm that list, and then you'll think about it. Probably the easiest way is to think about it in the order that the activities take place over the course of either the calendar year or your production year. We'll also ask you to think about those activities and how they apply to what we call orchard units in the tool, which is a little bit of a clunky term, but basically some activities are going to apply on a per tree basis, and some are going to apply on a per acre basis, and some are going to be kind of one-offs, and we refer to those as events. So that's something else you just want to think about as you're brainstorming your list of activities. And then ultimately what we're trying to do is come up with an activity rate for each one of the labor activities. And so really, it's a question of, how long does it take you to complete one of the activities per the orchard unit? So how many minutes does it take, per tree, or how many minutes does it take, per acre? And to come up with this data, there's a few different ways that you can do it. First off, if you're an experienced grower, then you probably, you can think back, just from your personal experience on, how long has it taken you to perform a particular task. So you might be able to, estimate that it takes you about, 4 hours to prune all of your 216 trees, for example. Or you might be able to estimate that it takes, well, about 90 seconds to prune a single tree, right? So that's a reasonable place to start. And if that's what you've got, you can certainly use that data and enter it into the tool. For those of you who are new growers who don't have personal experience, we have provided some reference rates as part of the tool, and these are a range of times that it took participants in the pilot program to perform the various activities on their farms. So it'll include typical activities like pruning and weeding, mowing, harvesting, etc. So that data is available. Those ranges are pretty wide, so it's a little bit hard to use it, but it would give you a place to start if you're trying to project out costs for a future orchard. But the best way to get accurate labor costing information is to do your own time trials. And I'll talk about that in just a couple of minutes. So the user's guide provides a list of sample activities, and so you can use that as a starting place. So it's categorized, pruning, mowing, harvesting, etc. And under each category, you'll list out any activities that are relevant to you and and what you do on your particular farm. And so in some cases, it might make sense to list an activity more than once. And some examples of that might be if you've got an orchard that has trees that are of different ages, then your pruning activities might take longer or shorter on older versus younger trees. And so it might make sense to have an entry for pruning, 2-year-old trees versus pruning, 5-year-old or mature trees. Similarly, if you handle suckering and weeding all together in one pass, then a single entry that's suckering and weeding might make sense. But if you have different methods for doing that, then having separate entries for for controlling suckers and doing weeding, then that might make sense. Also, if you weed in different ways, right? If some of the weeding is done by hand and some is mechanical, then having separate entries for those might make sense too. Or mowing is another example, right? So it's probably easiest to have just a single mowing rate for the orchard, but it turns out that spring mowing might be very different than summer mowing, or the first mow of the season might be different than subsequent mows later in the season. So again, just you'll need to think through, are there significant difference under different conditions for some of the activities, and then you can list those as separate activities. Note too that I've got a list of events that you might want to consider, right? So things like mower setup, flail setup, travel time to the orchard. These are things that are not going to scale with the size of the orchard or the density of the orchard, but they're things that you are spending time on. It would be nice to be able to capture some of that time information. All right. So going back to time studies, so again, we're highly recommending that, if you have the chance that that you perform these time trials on your orchard, and that'll allow you to, have a deeper understanding of, where you're spending your time and how long it's taking you to do these various activities. It's really as simple as measuring the total time that you spend, and then also measuring the total number of units affected. Right. So as I mentioned earlier, maybe it took you 4 hours to prune 300 trees, whatever those numbers are. You should note, of course, that the time it's going to take you to complete any given task is going to be variable. right? So it varies, by person who's doing the work. It varies depending on the weather conditions. Is it raining? It might take you longer than if it's sunny. I talked about mowing earlier, right? The first mow of the season might be different than the subsequent mows later in the summer. So we're going to recommend that you sample your times under different conditions, and that will help you account for the variability that you might have. It's important to note that when you're gathering this data, that it doesn't have to be perfect, and that you also don't need to count every tree, right? So it's really a sampling technique, and so it's perfectly reasonable to say, I'm going to prune 100 trees and see how long that takes me, and then you can generate a per tree value and extrapolate that out for the rest of the orchard. Similarly, you can do it in another direction. You can say, I'm going to prune for 2 hours and see how many trees that covered, and then again you can extrapolate that out. So it doesn't have to be, you don't have to measure every minute you're out in the fields. This sampling technique should work fine for you. And ultimately, in order to be successful, right, it is a little bit of a hassle. Definitely will acknowledge that, and we'll talk about that a little bit later with our panelists. But once you establish a process that can work for you and the other workers who are gathering time data, it should be relatively straightforward. It requires a little bit of planning and discipline, but it doesn't have to be a burden. Okay, so the second type of production costs that the tool helps calculate are those associated with machinery. And so the production costs associated with machinery are going to include fuel consumed, as well as costs that are associated with repairs and maintenance for your equipment. And so, similar to labor activities, you'll start by just generating a list of all the machines that you're using during your production process. And that should include, any specialty equipment that you use, implements that you put on your tractor to perform different tasks, and also general purpose machines. So some people listed out their pickup truck because some of the tasks that they do, they're using the pickup to accomplish those tasks. You'll need to know ahead of time the PTO associated with, the PTO horsepower associated with any of the machines that have PTO. And also, since repair and maintenance are part of those production costs, you want to make sure you have access to those records, whether that's in your QuickBooks or you've got receipts, wherever you have that information. So, the assumption here is that, past year's records will be able to help you predict what your future costs might be. And again, the third category of costs that we're going to be calculating are those associated with the inputs that go onto your orchard, right? So these are, whatever you're using to enhance soil fertility, providing crop nutrition, or anything that you're adding to prevent or control weeds or pests or diseases. So here, again, you'll want to list out what all those inputs are, and then you'll want to go and find your sales receipts so that you know how much you actually spent. But you're also going to need to know how much was consumed of what you bought, and also what it was applied to. So just as an example, let's imagine you bought $5,000 worth of mulch, but you only used half of it. And so your actual usage is $2,500 worth. And then if you've spread that on 10 acres, then your application rate is $250 per acre. Okay, so that's all the preliminary work that you'll need to do. And then for the next little while, I'm going to walk you through actually using the tool itself and how the data gets entered into the spreadsheet. And so just some high-level tips before we start. You'll notice that some of the columns are white and some of them are gray. The white ones is where you're going to enter your information. The gray ones are where there's formulas, and so the tool will be doing calculations. So the goal of this worksheet is to list out all your activities. So as I mentioned earlier, as part of the preliminaries, you should have been generating this list of activities. And so you're going to want to enter that information here. You're going to want to indicate so just backing up for a second. So the goal here is we're going to try to come up with a base rate in minutes per orchard unit for each one of these activities. And so as far as the orchard units go, you'll want to use whatever unit kind of makes sense to use. So for pruning, it might make sense to think about, pruning an individual tree, whereas for, mowing, it's not per tree, it's really, more per acre. And so, so you'll list out the labor activities and then the orchard unit that it applies to, and then you'll fill in your time data, whatever you've got. So whether that's your estimates, or it's from your actual time trials, or from the reference data, you'll enter in the minutes it took you and the number of orchard units that it applies to, and then the tool will calculate the minutes per orchard unit. And so you'll do that if you have multiple time trials, like we've recommended for, especially for certain activities where there is a lot of variability. You can enter in, multiple instances of those time trials, and then we'll generate an average for you. And then ultimately, you'll just select a base rate. And when you're doing your initial analysis, you'll probably just use the average that you come up with. Later on, I'll be talking about kind of future analysis, doing some projections, in which case you might want to adjust some of those values up or down. You'll go through a similar process with your machinery. You'll list out all of your machinery. And here, the goal is to come up with an operating cost per hour for each of the machines. And so you'll provide a fuel cost per gallon. You'll provide the PTO horsepower for any of the machines that have PTO. And then we'll generate for you fuel and lube costs. You put in your repair and maintenance costs, and also the hours of use during the season, right? So here I'm showing the New Holland tractor, the repair and maintenance cost was $650, used it for 150 hours. And so then that allows us to get a repair and maintenance cost, per hour. So the tool ultimately comes up with an operating cost per hour for each of the tools. And then we ask you to do one more step when it comes to machinery. And so this worksheet is used to account for the fact that some of the activities require multiple pieces of equipment, right? And each has its own operating costs. So to do flail mowing, you're using both your flail and you're using your tractor. And so the total cost for doing flail mowing is the individual costs of the two together. So imagine that the tractor was calculated at $21.50 an hour, and the flail was calculated at $18.50 an hour. So the total for the combination is $40 an hour. And so you'll need to build this table up so we can get those combinations recorded. Next, when it comes to inputs, again, you'll be listing out all of your inputs. You'll indicate the orchard unit again. In most cases, that's going to wind up being acres, probably. And then we also need to know your cost per orchard unit. And so, as an example, let's imagine you bought a bottle of sea crop. It cost you $72. You used half of it, so that's $36 worth. You applied it to your 9-acre orchard, so it wound up being $4 per acre. And so that's the calculation that'll go into this table here. Okay, so now that's all the preliminary work that you'll do. And now you're ready to actually go through and enter the data that will generate your costing information for you. And it might look complicated, but the process is actually pretty straightforward. It's all supported in the user's guide, and the tool does all the math. So you're mostly just pulling data that you've already entered when you get to this point. And you're going to start by entering a cost of labor per hour, as well as the total trees and total acres that make up your orchard. And as far as coming up with a labor cost per hour, certainly if you've got employees and you know what their hourly wage is, then that can be pretty straightforward. But I know for a lot of you, the work is being done by you and your family members. This isn't actually a cash cost, and so but we're still asking you to come up with a value. Um, in order to in order to do a full costing analysis of your orchard, then understanding the costs related to labor, even if they're not cash costs, is still an important part of the process. So if you do need to estimate this value, you could estimate what it would cost you per hour to hire out the labor, or you could put in a value that you'd like to be reimbursed for your time for the work that you're doing. So then in the next section, the tool is going to go ahead and calculate your costs related to labor and machinery. So you'll start by listing out your labor activities. And this is just a matter of selecting from a list. We'll generate the list based on the labor activities that you put in that earlier worksheet. And then you also need to indicate what machines that you machines that you use to do that work, or none if you don't use a machine. So pruning, perhaps you're not using machines. And then we'll pull over the data that was calculated earlier. And in this rate to use column, you can, most cases you'll want to just use the base rate that got calculated, but this is where you'll have an opportunity if there are reasons for, particularly if you're doing like future analysis for making changes. Ultimately, oh, okay. And then you also put in percentage of orchard units and that the activity applied to and the number of times you've done it. So maybe you're only pruning half your orchard, so it's 50%, but you're also flail mowing 8 times. So you'd list 8 times as the number of occurrences. And then the tool is going to go ahead and calculate the total minutes spent on each activity, convert it to hours, and then come up with a labor cost based on your cost of labor per hour. And it's also going to come up with a machinery cost, the number of hours the machine's in use times its hourly rate. Those values are summed up over there in the right-hand columns, and then the totals are generated down at the bottom there. It'll be a similar process for inputs. You'll list out all your inputs. You'll indicate what which costs you should be using if you have a compelling reason to adjust those, and then also the percentage of orchard units that you're applying it to, and the number of occurrences, number of times you're applying each input, and we'll generate a total for you there as well. So then ultimately, all of that costing information is going to be summed up in this results section here. So you can see it comes up with a total cost for your labor, your machinery, and your inputs. And those added together are your total variable costs. And another view of those costs is shown in a pie chart that we generate, and that allows you to get a visual of what your relative expenditures are in each of those costing areas. So the next thing you can do as using the tool is you can put in a price per pound and the total number of pounds of nuts that you harvested, and that'll allow us to generate the total revenues for the year. And then ultimately your returns, your profits over your total variable costs are going to be calculated as well, revenues minus your total variable cost there. Okay. So so that's the basic use of the tool. And once you've gotten that far, you have some information about what your returns are over your variable costs. But of course, you've got other costs as well. And so in addition to just considering your variable costs, your analysis should probably include other costs that go into production, your fixed costs. So in this example, I've included organic certification, property taxes, property insurance, costs of sales and marketing would go into this category. So the tool doesn't do this work for you, but the user's guide does walk you through a process that you can use to generate this information for yourself. So that's a single year's worth of analysis, and it will give you a deeper understanding of of what your costs are for producing the nuts that you do. But and if your orchard is fully mature, then it's quite likely that on an ongoing basis, your costs are going to stay relatively stable. And doing this 1 year of analysis might be sufficient. But if if your orchard is still maturing, then it probably makes sense to do a multi-year analysis. And so basically, that's a matter of running through this process multiple times, projecting into the future any changes that might occur. So the change that's most likely in a maturing orchard, of course, is going to be your yield, right? So the number of pounds of nuts that you harvest in any given year should be increasing year to year as the orchard matures. And so there's a fairly straightforward way to just put in updated yield information to see what your returns are under those conditions. And similarly, you can make other changes as well as you project out into the future. And then if you do this for multiple years, you can build a table like the one I'm showing here, which I pull from the user's guide, to do this multi-year analysis and see how your returns are hopefully increasing year over year. So the user's guide also goes through a variety of other kinds of analysis that you can do using the tool. So one of them is to understand how your returns over time are going to be covering your establishment costs, right? So for the first number of years that you've had your orchard, you either you didn't have any returns, right? You didn't have any nuts, or perhaps you had small harvests. And so eventually the idea, of course, is that you're going to be able to cover those establishment costs with future sales of your nuts as the orchard matures. And so the user's guide goes through a process that you can use to see how you can cover those establishment costs as the orchard matures. Another analysis that you can do is to make sure that you are able to cover your replacement costs, right? So your machinery is going to wear over time. Eventually, it's going to need to be replaced, and so ideally, your orchard is generating enough revenues that you could put aside that you can then be in a place to cover the costs of replacement. And so we go through an exercise in the user's guide using the tool to calculate what your machinery costs are while including the costs for replacement. The tool can also be used for a variety of what-if scenarios, right? Some of them are fairly straightforward, like I mentioned, right? If labor is more expensive, is the yield higher? Price of your nuts goes up or down, right? It's fairly easy to enter that information into the tool to see, to see how that impacts both your costs and, of course, your returns. We can also use the tool to do some more complex scenarios. And one we had particularly in mind when the tool was developed was being able to use it to look at a transition to organic scenario, right? So in order to do that, you would start, if you're a conventional grower and you're interested in looking at how what your financial picture might look like if you transition to organic. You can start by entering all the same data as I've described it for your conventional orchard and see what the tool tells you are your costs of production as well as your, excuse me, your variable cost of production as well as your returns. And then you can run that whole exercise again using an organic process. And so, you'll go through and you'd have to, of course, figure out, which inputs are going to need to change. How is the labor going to change? Is there any changes to machinery? You will be using projections, so using our reference data as a starting point. But then you'll be able to do a comparison so you get some sense of what the financial picture might look like under organic versus what it looks like under conventional. You can also use the tool to do any kinds of what-if scenarios. I list one in the user's guide here. I had a grower who was not yet generating enough, wasn't generating enough nuts to be able to sell them commercially. So they had costing data, but they didn't have any revenue data. And they were interested in, at what point and under what conditions might they be able to cover those costs of production. And so we listed out on the left side here different price points per pound, and then different yields across the top to see at what combinations they were able to cover those costs. Okay, so I've been talking for a while. I'm sure you're getting tired of hearing my voice. And so at this point, I'd like to go ahead and start engaging our panelists for discussion. So I will go ahead and I've got a handful of questions to ask of Ben and Peggy. And then I'm also interested in if you guys have questions for our panelists as well, you can go ahead and enter those in the question area, or when I'm through with my questions, we can also just, you can raise your hand if you have questions as well. So yeah, so maybe as a place to start, I know each of you introduced your orchard early on when we introduced ourselves earlier, but maybe you can do a little bit more in depth and tell us about your hazelnut farm, its age, its size, any growing practices that you have that might be of interest, and perhaps just ways in which your farm is unique. So Ben, why don't we start with you?
Yeah, so we manage three different orchards, which are all varying ages. So we have one that's about 40 years old, one that's about 20 years old, and then one that's anywhere from like 3 to 10 years old. So using this tool is a bit complex to account for all of those simultaneously, but it is possible. So it was a fun experiment to go through. And as far as our practices, we are pretty focused on just minimizing the amount of work that goes into maintaining the orchard. So we'll kind of can see here pictured is what our orchard looks like in the spring. We really don't do a lot out there until early summer when we start mowing. And another piece of kind of the uniqueness of our farm is we do direct marketing with the nuts, so we'll get them processed and get a higher price point that way, selling them locally primarily. But yeah, just a lot of different things going on at our farm, but trying to partly because it's so complex, trying to simplify it into as few practices out in the orchard as possible.
Great, thanks Ben. And Peggy?
Yeah, so I have one orchard and it is small, as I said, it's only 3 acres. The orchard was started in about 2010. And one of the main questions that I wanted to know from the tool was whether or not I was going to be able to afford, both in time and money, to expand the orchard to some other acreage on the farm that would be appropriate for hazelnuts. So I wanted to know whether I could afford to manage 10 acres instead of 3. And this tool is very good for doing that. I also want to just take a minute to thank both you and Tanya for creating it and for creating the user's guide as well. I think it's going to be useful for people.
Thanks.
So, in terms of practices, mainly I am, as Ben said, interested in keeping as much labor cost down as possible, both because it's a cost and also because I am aging. And so the things that I do have to be done by machine or by chemical means instead of by hand in general.
Thanks. So I'd like to talk a little bit about the time trials, which is, a big part of what we're pushing here with the tool is for people to gather their own data to really understand, what their actual costs are based on, the time they're spending in the orchard. And so, Peggy, maybe you can talk a little bit about how you gathered that data, what your methods were, and how that process went for you.
Yeah, when we first started this, Tanya suggested that there were apps that you could download to your phone that would allow you to keep track of time. Unfortunately, we don't have cell coverage out here that would allow that. So I keep a farm journal, and daily I would just update the farm journal with who worked in the orchard and what they were doing and how long they were there. So it was, as you said, it required some discipline to remember all that stuff and to actually enter it every day and not forget it. But it was doable. I mean, it wasn't terribly onerous. It's nice once and as you mentioned, it's not necessary to do to keep a record of everything that you do for a whole year, although that's essentially what I did. You could also just do it for a sample of either time or activity so that you could project from what you had sampled.
Great. Yeah, Ben?
Yeah, so for my process, it was didn't use technology very heavily either. I carry around a pocket planner everywhere I go, and so I just had a page dedicated to time trials, and anytime I'd conduct one, I'd write it in there. And then basically I just held on to that for the whole year, and then when it was time to input all my data, I just changed it, from handwritten into the Excel sheet, and did it that way. So not relying on technology so much until the end, because it's annoying to like get into all the apps and stuff. Nice to flip to a page quickly.
Sure. So maybe you can each talk a little bit about things that you learned from using the tool. Perhaps, yeah. What were the things that surprised you that came out of the data? Either activities that you wound up spending a lot more time on than you expected, or just looking at the data in the aggregate and saying, oh, we're spending a ton of time here. Yeah. So what was your experience both, using the tool and seeing the data that got spit out from doing so?
Yeah, the first thing I noticed is, wow, there are a lot of tasks to do. I was impressed with the list that I came up with. It was like almost 40 different things. And some of those are, just because we have different aged trees and we're doing different practices for different aged orchards. But that was one thing. The other thing that was nice about it was actually listing all of those and kind of like listing them in the order that we do them. So it's kind of like a production calendar too. So it's helpful to visualize that for kind of some like planning. And yeah, it's helpful to think about, okay, yeah, this is taking longer. Is there like a way that we can speed this up, or just how to anticipate like how much help we're going to need during different parts of the season. And so, yeah, that was great. And then the other thing was just kind of like after finishing the whole analysis is like, wow, yeah, there's quite a few costs, and um, the market is pretty tight for growers. So yeah, just recognizing that it can be pretty difficult to have a decent return growing hazelnuts.
Yeah, so I mean, as I said, one of the things was this what if that I wanted to look at. And the what if, I assumed showed me that I would either have to hire more labor or spend a lot more of my time in the orchard. And that some practices like weeding by hand, for instance, were just not going to be possible. So, yeah, it was an interesting exercise. And it's also nice to have data that will show you how much time it takes to do any given activity, so that if you, for instance, change machinery or change inputs, um, can you make a difference? Could I, by suckering with chemical methods, really make a difference in what time it took to do the suckering, for instance?
Interesting. Yeah. And how about in terms of like in um, I mean, you've started to talk about this a little bit, Peggy, sort of taking what you've learned and having that influence either, business decisions or production decisions, on the farm based on, what you learned by going through the process. Were there, sort of things like, aha, yeah, maybe we should try this instead of that, or were there ways that you pivoted based on the data that you collected?
Uh, well, the basic decision, which was to expand the acreage, is probably to decide not to do that.
Okay.
We have other possibilities for enterprises on the farm that have a better opportunity for penciling out in the end. Um, I was I was also able to use the tool to decide um, on purchasing machinery. So I did purchase a harvester rather than thinking that I would continue harvesting by hand. I'm not sure in the end that was the right decision, but it was helpful to have a tool to help make that decision, to know what the cost in labor was already, and be able to project it.
Great, thanks. Ben?
Yeah. I mean, it's such an easy tool to analyze the cost of like doing one more spraying or another mowing or another round of watering, those sorts of things, just kind of determining how much to do. And then in addition, having the data to kind of analyze whether or not it's effective to do a certain task. Like if we are, hiring a new employee, making sure that they're like, kind of doing it at some rate that we are hoping that they can do it in, or, figuring out if we should plant or buy equipment.
So I will speak for Ben. He is in a school, and I imagine the bells are ringing. So he'll be back with us in a second.
Yeah, and just the last one of, making practice decisions based on that.
Great. Yeah. So one of the things that I think surprised some of the people that I spoke with, so a lot of the labor was being done by owner labor or family labor, and so it's not a cash cost, right? And so when you look at your numbers in QuickBooks, you don't see it as an actual expenditure if you're doing the work yourself. But it's important to account for owner labor as part of this analysis. And so yeah, so I'm curious in terms of like just thinking about the time that you're putting into the orchard and your returns, right? So we set up the tool so that you can say, I'd really like to get paid, compensated at X dollars. That's a number you can also play around with. Um, but just to make sure that the time that you're putting in is actually being covered by your revenues. And I'm curious if you had any thoughts on that.
So my time was not covered by your revenues, not in any way, shape, or form. I
Yeah.
think it's true of a lot of farmers that we farm because we love farming. And so I will continue with my acreage, even though I may never make any money from it. But I would like to be, I would not, it's nice to be able to know that, 50 cents an hour is what I can expect for my time.
Ouch. Ben.
Yeah, I put in $20 an hour. We about broke even, so feels good that there are some other costs there that we like didn't fully finish with the full analysis. So that was kind of on just the variable cost there. So
Yeah.
probably a little under 20, but hopefully we see some bigger yields in the future.
Okay. Well, I see we're running short on time. Is there anyone on the call who have questions for me about the tool or for Peggy or Ben? You can feel free to unmute yourself and just ask, or you can ask it through the question tool, I guess, through GoToWebinar. Is there anybody out there who has anything to add or to any questions to ask?
Hi, I have a question related to the tool. My name's Joseph
Sure.
Gallegos. Um, does it allow you to edit the different rows and columns as well, so we can change some of the inputs?
Yes. So for example, if you start with your base, and then there is a fairly straightforward way that you can say, no, I want to change, from this one to, this input to that input, um, and be able to kind of toggle between them. And the user's guide walks you through how you would be able to do that.
Okay, thank you. And for Ben, since you have different farms, you run the tool as a separate tool for each farm?
No, so there's this built-in feature that you can apply a practice to a percentage of each of your total orchard. And so as long as your orchards are all on the same spacing, it can be, you can, say, okay, well, for those 20 of my 40 acres, so 50%, you would apply it for, 50% if you're only doing that on 20 acres of if you had 40.
Okay, great. And one last question about the tool. I didn't notice it allowed you to put in employment taxes and items like that, or you just put a lump sum in for your labor costs?
Yeah, and so we recommend that you do a fully loaded. So maybe if you've got an average hourly wage, you put on a 10% or a 12%, above that to cover the taxes and insurance. So, but yes, the tool doesn't specifically allow, do those calculations for you.
Thank you.
That's it. All right. Anything else? Oops. Great. So I think we're about out of time. Thank you all for joining us, and thank you, Ben and Peggy, for sharing your experiences, and also just thank you for being part of the pilot program and helping keep this steered in the right direction and bringing it to completion. As I mentioned earlier, we will be sending you uh, an email with a link to a survey. We'd very much appreciate it if you could just fill out the survey. It should just be a couple of minutes to do that. And then once you return that survey, we will send you a link to to where you can download the tool from the Oregon Tilth website. So again, thanks everybody, and enjoy your afternoon.